A key faction within the Chinese Communist Party has allegedly provided Trump and the DOJ with hard drives containing evidence against Joe Biden and his ties to CCP leader Xi Jinping. But the factional battles behind this in China should raise alarms for U.S. authorities on what the actual motives are. I'll be speaking about this more, so stay tuned. The White House has been warning about the CCP's United Front, noting that the Chinese regime regards it as a, quote, magic weapon. I'll be going in-depth into this. Also, 3 hard drives were allegedly provided to the Trump administration by the Gong faction in the CCP. I'll be going into the details surrounding this. And also, I'll be interviewing Sergeant Betsy Brantner Smith on Antifa actions on the ground and how police officers are responding to it. Welcome back, everyone. First off, with the Ccp virus, Chinese state media reported that authorities in Kashgar, Xinjiang have completed their announced virus tests of all 4.74 million residents in the Uyghur Autonomous Region. Afterwards, Chinese authorities reported that 183 people had the virus, while the rest tested negative. Now, it's important to note, the Chinese Communist Party does not have a good track record when it comes to reporting numbers on this, especially when the numbers relate to national security interests and their global image. But while it's reporting low cases in Xinjiang, it was reporting no cases in other spots where also millions of people were tested. And also, it's possible the Chinese Communist Party has other motives for these tests, especially in the region of the persecuted Muslim Uyghurs, again in Xinjiang where these tests took place. And in Xinjiang as well, the Chinese Communist Party has placed the region on quarantine and also launched the tests after allegedly found just 5 cases. Meanwhile, the European Union Commissioner has tested positive for the virus. And also in the United States, the FDA has now approved remdesivir as a treatment for the virus, for both adults and for children. Now, in other news, the United States and India signed a pact to share sensitive satellite data. This is being done in the context of what Secretary of State Mike Pompeo warned Tuesday is an increasingly assertive China. This is again deepening that alliance with the U.S. And also during comments to the London-based Policy Exchange, Deputy National Security Advisor Matt Pottinger is warning of the CCP's United Front system. He noted that the massive system has no equivalent in Western democratic societies, and that the close to 90 million party members of the CCP are required to support the activities of the branch that the CCP calls its, quote, magic weapon. He noted that in the direct branch alone, the United Front Work Department, there are around 4 times as many cadres as the U.S. State Department has Foreign Service officers. Yet he noted as well, quote, instead of practicing diplomacy with foreign governments, the Chinese Foreign Ministry handles that. The United Front gathers intelligence about and works to influence private citizens overseas. In other words, this is an additional system on top of their normal foreign relations. And he added, quote, the focus is on foreign elites and the organizations they run. Think of the United Front worker as a cross between an intelligence collector, a propagandist, and a psychologist. And he noted as well that part of this system, the CCP is compiling digital dossiers of millions of foreign citizens around the world, designed to help its agents carry out this work. Now, those of you as well who follow the show know that a lot of my research as an investigative reporter going back to 2008 has been investigating and exposing the United Front Work Department and its different systems. For the Chinese Communist Party, this is a way of controlling societies by controlling the elite of societies. And they have many different ways of doing that. Whether it's honey traps, it's like sex traps, whether it's business deals, whether it's direct influence, whether it's mild things such as, say, speaking engagements and pseudo-friendships, where they feel obligated to support these people because they think they believe in what they're saying. The Chinese Communist Party has many different programs targeting people and identifying their shortcomings and on a moral level typically in order to exploit them and make them serve the functions of the Chinese Communist Party. For the CCP again, this is a way of controlling the elite, the business leaders, the academics, the journalists, and the politicians of each targeted society. Now, meanwhile, the New York Times recently ran a hit piece on the Epoch Times which, like previous hit pieces like this, avoided actually disproving any reporting from the Epoch Times, and instead focused on trying to tie the paper to publications it has no connections to, making misleading generalizations, and attacking the religious beliefs of some of its staff. Now, this article came out around a week ahead of the November elections. It was run on the front page of the New York Times Sunday paper, and the tech columnist the New York Times assigned to write the hit piece had spent at least 8 months on it. The timing of this, the amount of time and investment the New York Times put into it, and the prominent position it made for this article, despite it not really saying anything beyond similar hit pieces, suggests the importance that the New York Times places on trying to attack the Epoch Times. And this is also in spite of the fact that the article is fairly flimsy from a journalistic standpoint. Now, the Epoch Times noted in its response that rather than attempting to give a fair portrayal of the Epoch Times, the New York Times instead, quote, resorts to factual errors, innuendo, and misrepresentations in an attempt to smear a competing media outlet. And notes that at the heart of the hit piece appears to be discontent by the New York Times at what the Epoch Times has become, which in its own words is, quote, one of the country's most powerful digital publishers. It also notes the tech columnist behind the article and the media columnist who contributed to it have made posts on social media that demonstrate personal bias, including on tweets that he later deleted. And in his article, he also exclusively interviews disgruntled former employees while ignoring any positive comments, some of which we know they got. Epoch Times notes, for example, that the columnist interviewed Chinese dissident Guo Wengui for this article, yet didn't include the quotes. We know about this because Guo mentioned it in a video, and he stated that the New York Times columnist interviewed him on false premise that it would be about Guo. But after he agreed to the interview and showed up, instead of asking about Guo, he asked questions about the Epoch Times, which Guo actually praised. Guo stated in his video that he respects what the Epoch Times is doing.
我说他们做得非常棒，非常好，我非常尊敬。大纪元，我说你知道，在香港大街上就一个大纪元在那块架着摄像机，对着他妈这个共产党在那块咣咣咣这么直播，那容易吗？那玩意儿，说着容易。我说你去呀，你不在香港吗？
The New York Times columnist did not include Guo's positive comments, which led the Epoch Times to question, quote, is it common for the New York Times to only include quotes from people who speak negatively about a topic they cover? How is this not an example of severe bias? And even beyond this, the New York Times turns to attacks on the religious beliefs of some staff at the Epoch Times, and also the beliefs of many early staff, in particular in Falun Gong. Now, as you know, we were originally founded by Chinese dissidents living in the United States who saw a need for accurate reporting of what's happening in China after having witnessed the Tiananmen Square massacre and other persecution campaigns by the CCP. Now, the response to the article notes that the persecution of Falun Gong in China is extensively documented by human rights groups and government bodies, including the U.S. State Department, and the Chinese Communist Party's use of torture, including the sexual torture of women, forced labor, and live organ harvesting of Falun Gong practitioners is also well documented. And while framing its narrative to attack the Epoch Times and some of its staff members, the New York Times doesn't provide this context to its readers. And the Epoch Times notes in its response to the New York Times, the Chinese Communist Party has even used reporting from the New York Times, and notably the exact same columnist who wrote this piece, in its own state propaganda to attack Falun Gong, and to justify its own campaigns that are proven by many international bodies to include large-scale torture and, yes, the harvesting of organs from living people as a way of killing them for profit. The Falun Dafa Information Center, a human rights organization, and its executive director, Levi Brody, who I've interviewed on the show previously, stated, quote, "We are saddened to see the New York Times malign Falun Gong in an attack on a rival media outlet. The mistakes made in this article about the Buddhist-based spiritual practice, as well as the significant omissions surrounding the persecution in China, signal a bizarre and troubling downturn of what was once a pillar of American journalism." And Brody notes something even further, which is that the attack on a business rival and the inaccurate smear of a persecuted religious group come in context of the close to 20 years of silence from the New York Times on the human rights abuses still taking place in China against people who practice Falun Gong. He adds, quote, Indeed, at least one former reporter from the New York Times has publicly stated that she was discouraged from investigating evidence of forced organ removals from Falun Gong prisoners of conscience. And the amount of information the New York Times could have added is staggering. The Falun Dafa Information Center notes, for example, in 2007, the United Nations reported that, quote, Falun Gong practitioners accounted for 66% of victims of alleged torture while in government custody. It notes that Freedom House reported in 2017 that, quote, Falun Gong practitioners across China are subject to widespread surveillance, arbitrary detention, imprisonment, and torture, and they are at a high risk of extrajudicial execution. Now let's be clear. By assisting the Chinese Communist Party in its cover-up of this information, willingly or unwillingly, and by writing hit pieces the Chinese Communist Party is using in its persecution, the New York Times has blood on its hands. And when an independent tribunal confirmed in 2019 that the Chinese Communist Party was in fact killing Falun Gong practitioners for their organs, quote, on a significant scale, the findings were covered by many news outlets, including BBC, Forbes, The Wall Street Journal, NBC, and others. Yet for some reason, the New York Times was silent, continuing this trend regardless of such major findings on human rights abuses. Now, why was that? And why did the recent hit piece include outright lies about Falun Gong and its beliefs, advancing the CCP's disinformation campaign to justify these abuses? Well, those are questions for the New York Times to answer. But as the Falun Dafa Information Center notes, maybe it has something to do with the 2001 meeting between New York Times publisher Arthur Sulzberger Jr. and former CCP leader Jiang Zemin, who single-handedly launched the persecution against Falun Gong back in 1999. It notes that with only one notable exception in 2009, quote, after this meeting, there was no meaningful reportage about the Falun Gong persecution for the next 20 years. Now, in recent years, the Epoch Times, which Crossroads is a part of, has been a frequent target of hit pieces like this, and they've been used to go after our revenue streams as well. It's for this reason that the Epoch Times has built a business model where it's mainly financed by its readers through subscriptions. Now, for anyone interested in supporting the Epoch Times and this channel through that, and its mission to bring integrity back to journalism, please consider signing up for a trial subscription to judge for yourself the quality of our journalism. This will support us as we strive forward. Meanwhile, Epoch Times contributor Dr. Wang Yu-chun has some unique insights into the 3 hard drives allegedly provided to the Trump administration and the U.S. Department of Justice by Jiang Zemin, Zheng Qinghong, and Meng Jianzhu. The move was reported by Lewd Media on October 14th, which alleged the hard drives contained, quote, nuclear bomb-level evidence that Xi Jinping had built a relationship with Democratic presidential nominee Joe Biden. Now, it's important to note, the claim has not been independently confirmed, but given the many leaks now taking place around Biden, it would not be far-fetched. The big question here, though, is why Jiang, Zheng, and Meng would have interest in passing evidence to the Trump administration, given they're some of the top players in the Jiang faction in China, and they're by no means a positive force. Again, Jiang Zemin being the main guy on that faction. The most likely reason is they believe Trump is going to win against Biden, and so they're attempting to capitalize on this both to curry favor with Trump in his second term and to launch their own attacks against Xi Jinping, who leads their main rival faction in China. Now, Dr. Yu-chun, who is a former writer for Wei Jianxing, a member of the Standing Committee of the Political Bureau of the CCP, writes in the analysis that another key figure in the incident is Cai Feng, who Hunter Biden also has a close relationship with. Now, Cai Feng is the son-in-law of Dai Xianglong, the former governor of the People's Bank of China. And every time Hunter goes to Beijing, he allegedly contacts Cai Feng and stays at the courtyard at number 11 Pangyu Daguan. The hard drive allegedly contains obscene videos and photos of 2 men there. Now, Trump lawyer Rudy Giuliani, who received similar files on Hunter Biden through a laptop hard drive, is also alleging there are many photos and videos of Hunter with Chinese girls, many of whom appear to be underage. There are also the hard drives allegedly held by exiled Chinese billionaire Guo Wengui, as well as information, emails, and documents being released by former business associates of Hunter Biden, all of which are exposing similar information through different channels, as well as allegations of Hunter using the position of Joe Biden when he was vice president in the Obama administration to make some of these deals. It appears that Jiang and his faction have taken the leaks as an opportunity, seeing how many different people are leaking information on Joe Biden and Hunter Biden, and they're using this again to capitalize to gain their own favor, and in their political battles as well, taking place behind the scenes in China. Again, the Jiang faction and the Xi faction are the two main political factions in China fighting for control of the country. Now, for them, this is likely strategic. The Chinese Communist Party is led by Xi Jinping, and the Xi faction, again, is the main rival faction of the Jiang faction, Jiang being 2 leaders ago, Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, Xi Jinping. The Chinese Communist Party stays the Chinese Communist Party regardless of who's in power. The target, the main issue in China, is the Chinese Communist Party, not the leading faction of it. Now, it's unclear whether the Trump administration plans to do anything with these hard drives provided by the Jiang faction. But again, they should become aware, if this is true, of what the Jiang faction may be using it for. The Chinese Communist Party has files like this on many different public leaders. One of the main Chinese Communist Party programs exposed by Guo Wengui is the manipulation of them through money, through personal interest, and through sex and honey traps. They use programs like this to get people into their system and then create blackmail material to keep them in their system. The Chinese Communist Party does this as one of its main roads for espionage and one of its main roads for foreign influence and control. The Chinese Communist Party very likely could do this to a whole lot of people if it wanted to. And the CCP strategically releasing this at this time is very likely not because they would do it normally, but because they see this information coming out anyways, and the Jiang faction in particular sees it as an opportunity, given that it's coming out, whether they do anything or not, to release its own information to curry favor at a key time. Again, we'll have to see whether this information is true, and we'll also have to see how it unfolds. Now also, folks, there are 2 different realities being shown when it comes to Antifa and its actions to physically attack people they disagree with politically. The Trump administration is looking to designate Antifa as a terrorist organization, and many Democrats have also argued, on the other hand, that Antifa is an idea and not an organization. To give us some deeper insights into Antifa and how it operates on the ground, we've invited to speak with us National Police Association spokesperson and retired sergeant, Betsy Brantner Smith, to speak about this. Let's jump into that now. Sergeant Betsy Brantner Smith, it's a real pleasure to have in Crossroads.
Thank you, Josh. I'm so excited to be here.
So with Antifa, the Trump administration is talking about designating them as a terrorist organization. And I know some Democrats have pushed back on that, saying it's an ideology, not a movement. What would you say to that?
Well, yeah, Antifa is more than just an idea. Antifa has quite a history, going back to the 20s and the 30s and Hitler's brown shirts. And then, we can come into the anarchists of the 60s, through today. The problem I think that the left has in identifying Antifa is there's no head of the organization. There's no real paramilitary structure. So, the left likes to be able to go to a blue check Twitter account and say, okay, this guy's the head of Antifa. That's not how it works. And, but Antifa structure is really more like that of an Islamic terror cell, something like that. But just because we don't have a paramilitary structure for Antifa doesn't mean they don't exist, and it doesn't mean they're not dangerous.
Well, that's an interesting point, because in my own reporting, I've written about lone wolf terrorists and these self-starter terrorists. They're designated as terrorists based on their actions and based on their ideology, but not based on some kind of superstructure of some kind. It's based on what they're doing. And if people are arguing you can't label Antifa as a terrorist organization because it doesn't have some, super hierarchy to it. But we do have terrorist groups designated as such that are lone wolf, self-starters, self-radicalized, and so on. How can they make this distinction, I guess?
Well, what we have to do is look at their actions. And, for example, we have dealt with for quite a while in this country, going back to radical Islam, these, what you said, lone wolf terrorists who no, are they a lieutenant or a captain in ISIS? No. That's how we have to look at Antifa. Do they follow the beliefs of Antifa? Do they dress like Antifa? Are they mobilized as part of Antifa? And that's what we're seeing. And I think we're about to see it again this weekend. We've got a couple of things brewing in this country. The National Guard has been activated in Minnesota. We're also waiting to, we may get the grand jury results in the Jacob Blake shooting in Kenosha, Wisconsin. And if those things happen and people start to riot because of those decisions that are made and were made in Minneapolis today, you're going to see Antifa mobilize. And people need to start paying a lot more attention to that. And it's dangerous to the American public.
Well, this is an interesting point, too, because I used to report a lot on Middle East and what was going on there and radical Islam, terrorist groups. The way terrorism used to be defined was the use of violence for a political motive. And based on that definition, it seems a bit bizarre, actually, that these types of actions, violence for a political motive and open statements of the intention to use violence, is not being designated as terrorist movements and not even really punished, really being let to kind of do whatever they want. And, I think the problem we have as a country right now is, at least for conservatives, when they see this, they don't believe the police are doing anything about it. We understand, of course, that your hands are kind of tied behind your backs. But when they get arrested, the DAs, the prosecutors tend to just let them off. How do you see a solution in this?
Well, many years ago, when I was a street sergeant in a law enforcement organization, we dealt with anarchists. They would come to various parts of the country, including where I worked, and they would protest. They would try to take over our retail areas, take over our streets. The way that we dealt with them, and they had very similar philosophies to what we would call Antifa today. What we did with them is we would arrest them for violations of the law. Let me go back. First, what we would do is try to work with them. People need to be able to, in the United States, engage in peaceful protest. That is part of the American DNA, and part of law enforcement's job is to be able to provide people with a safe, designated area so that they can protest what they're upset about. And that's what we've seen with some of Black Lives Matter's protests, is they have been peaceful. The problem is the radical Marxist arm of Black Lives Matter Incorporated has now hooked up with Antifa, and now they don't peacefully protest. They burn, they loot, they riot. So how do we stop that? We arrest them for violating the law is step one. Step two is we prosecute them. And that is what we are missing in most of our law enforcement's fight against Antifa. For example, in Portland, their local prosecutor rarely will prosecute the rioters. So what happens? The federal government stepped in and took over some of that prosecution. When people are protesting, rioting in the name of Antifa, they don't want to have to get arrested and then have to come back in a month or 2 months or 6 months, hire an attorney, go to court, and go to prison. And that's the piece that we're missing. That's how we would get rid of all of this, is arrest and prosecute to the fullest extent of the law.
When it comes to these movements themselves, I know that I've heard people say it. They're like, oh, the protests were mostly peaceful. And, I think that there's almost like two different realities on this. There's the reality shown to people by a lot of the, unfortunately, mainstream media that do show scenes mostly of peaceful protests. I mean, some, like CNN, will show, reporters standing in front of burning buildings, and they'll say mostly peaceful protest. And people see that, and they're like, what kind of like play on false reality is this? But of course, if you look at the numbers, there are people legitimately protesting peacefully. There are people, the radical sectors of it, who are very radical and are burning buildings, looting, fighting, committing acts of violence randomly sometimes. I mean, I've kind of made the comparison before. If you go back to like the American Civil War, or the Revolutionary War, like 3% of people fought in that war. You could say it was a mostly peaceful It's only 3%. But how do we define this stuff? But I think it causes problems for police, though, because they're at the front lines of this. And if they're being told by one side, these are peaceful protesters, and they're like saying, no, it's not. They're attacking us. They're threatening us. They're releasing details on our families' names and our home addresses, and they see it as a personal threat to their own safety. I guess a couple points on this. Do you think this impedes their ability to enforce the law, and do you think this makes it so they are afraid to enforce the law?
Well, sure. When we see cops, and I talk to cops all over the country, and they're standing on these riot lines, or they're in the federal courthouse in Portland while Antifa is setting fire to it. And it comes down to leadership. It comes down to police leadership. One of the things that every police leader in this country needs to do, and some have done this, is that they need to videotape, have their own video. Don't rely on the media. Don't even rely just on body cameras, but have their own videographers out there. And this is a common tactic that we used to do when we talked about crowd control. We need our own videographers out there videoing and documenting the mostly peaceful protests and showing the American public what is really happening. This is just what Donald Trump did with 60 Minutes. He had his own videographer in there to show what really happens. That's what law enforcement leadership needs to do as well. And then they need to release it. But we have, depending on the area of the country we're talking about, we have a law enforcement leadership that is afraid of Antifa. They are in bed with the left. And so they don't want to show these non-peaceful protests. The American public is being deceived. We all know that by the legacy media. And law enforcement officers are the victims of it.
Well, I've actually spoken with different law enforcement officers, including sheriff's deputies, and they told me something interesting at the height of these protests with Black Lives Matter and Antifa, that the local protests they had actually were peaceful, but there were groups coming in from out of town, oftentimes even out of state, who were radical. And when those groups came in, they were the ones looting and burning and attacking people. And what they ended up doing was they actually made friends with the local branches, the peaceful branches, and if they had alerts that these radical branches were going to come into town, they would alert the local branches, and they would oftentimes cancel the events. And then they told the local branches, protest all you want, we're not even going to come out unless you guys do something illegal. And actually, they ended up behaving pretty decently in some of these areas. It was an interesting experiment, I think, in terms of local engagement with the peaceful branches of these protests, and really identifying the difference between them and the radical branches of this. Do you see this as a working model for other areas?
And that's a very common tactic That's a very common tactic in dealing with people who want to protest. Again, as a law enforcement, I've been involved in law enforcement for 40 years. As a law enforcement officer, I stood on protest lines protecting people that I vehemently, personally disagreed with. However, when police work is one of the few jobs out there where when we get hired, we put up our right hand and we swear to uphold the Constitution. And a big part of our constitutional rights as Americans is free speech. And that includes the freedom to be able to protest, to speak out. So you're absolutely right. And I was just in Chicago a few weeks ago, training some police officers in the far north suburbs. And they told me they had all worked Black Lives Matter protests, and that the Black Lives Matter protesters all came up to them, thanked them for their service, thanked them for their assistance in being able to peacefully speak their minds. So that's a great tactic, what you spoke of. It's a very common tactic. The problem is when these groups of disruptors, the Marxist arm of Black Lives Matter Incorporated, and of course Antifa, come in, they mobilize very quickly within 12 to 24 hours. And I'm afraid that's what we're going to see this weekend and beyond.
Sergeant Betsy Brantner Smith, it's a real pleasure having the show. Thank you.
Thanks, Josh.
Now, with that said, folks, we're broadcasting 5 days a week, Monday through Friday. Also on Sundays, I do a live Q&A, 10:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Also, if you want to support us, please join us on Patreon. You You can find the link to our Patreon page in the description below. And also, if you haven't already, please don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps this channel. And if you want to go the extra mile, you can tell a friend or family member about Crossroads. Now, that said, folks, stay informed and stay free.